Yours.
Okay. So let me share my screen. Can you guys see? Okay. Can you see my, because I can't see it. Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I'm seeing you guys, but I'm not seeing my PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yep, the PowerPoint looks good. It says research overview.
Okay. I'm seeing you guys, but I'm not. Let me share my view. I mean, change my view so that I can see the PowerPoint as I'm speaking. Okay. Very good. Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to do a small overview of my research before I go into my final discussion so that you have a background of what I've been doing these last few years and what's led up to where I am today. Before I go into my main talk, I just wanted to let you know that my interest began when I started my PhD at the University of Puerto Rico in migration. When I was looking for things to talk about or things to write about, I knew that the one common factor I wanted to investigate was that of indigenous folklore and storytelling. So my first field research was in Dominica. And when I was there, oh, I'm trying to move my screen here. My screen is not advancing, I apologize. Okay. All right, I'm sharing the screen, but I'm not getting function of my screen's not advancing. Okay.
Maybe you should get out of the full screen mode and then you'll be able to navigate.
Sometimes if you like leave the or if you stop sharing and try sharing again, or maybe even just switch over to the PowerPoint view, because we can see your screen fine. It sounds like you could also see your PowerPoint too.
I can see my PowerPoint. Let me go to the PowerPoint screen. You're right. Okay. My screen. This is my screen.
Yeah, we see slide 1. It looks good.
Yeah, but I can't advance to slide 2. That's the problem.
Yeah,
Okay.
sometimes you could also just try stopping the screen share and then starting again. Sometimes the Zoom technology just does what it wants.
All right, stop sharing. No, the problem is that it won't let me stop sharing. This is my department Zoom, so I don't know. if we have a block or.
If you want, I mean, this may take maybe a couple of minutes, but you can share or you can send your PowerPoint slides to us and we can like show it from our screen as you talk.
Okay. Let's see.
And I think we can also stop your sharing from here.
Okay, which is good. And then I can reshare. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. And it's still not advancing. Okay, I may have to send you
Mhm.
my slides. So give me just a moment.
Okay.
And I apologize for the delay. I don't know why.
No problem. In
Yeah,
fact, I think to
have-
make it even easier, you could upload them to the chat. If you go to the chat and you go to file, I think you could just pick them from there.
Okay. Oh, look. Okay.
Oh, well.
Fantastic. It's moving now. Okay. So when I went to Dominica, I was fortunate enough to receive a copy of folklore from Garnet Joseph, who was a former Kalinago or Carib chief. And one of the stories that I read was called Hayali. And I'd like to read that story to you now. Hayali. The moon is a man with a dirty face, but in our lives he fills a vital place. Before the moon was a moon, it is said, a girl became pregnant, though not wed, by a lover, if we're right, who courted her covertly at night. Yes, at night. It was he who she didn't know, but many people say it was so. They say the girl's mother on watch took a stand, and taking some soot in her hand, with her hand, she daubed her lover's face with the same when he came, and from then on the marks on his face remained. Well, in the morning, with the dawning, they found that the girl's lover was really her brother. People mocked him so much that he, for shame, was the claim, withdrew to the sky up on high. It is there and how you will see him now, with the soot on his brow, on his very brow. Okay. So what I found in this book of myths was a myth that was very common in the Cherokee Nation as well. And having grown up Cherokee and hearing my grandmother, who was a storyteller, tell this tale when we were smaller, and not so much about incest, but sort of as a origin of the moon story. I started making connections. The Cherokee version goes like this. Moon lived in the West. The girl had a lover who used to come every month in the dark of the moon to court her. He would come at night and leave before daylight, and although she talked with him, she could not see his face in the dark. And he would tell her, and he wouldn't tell her what his name was. So what happened was, she wanted to find out who he was, so she stuck her hands into some ashes. And when he came to visit her, she looked at him and said, "Oh, you look so cold," and was rubbing his face and leaving the ashes without his knowledge. The next night, when the moon came up in the sky, his face was covered in spots, and that was when his sister knew that he was the one who had been coming to see her. He was so ashamed to have her know it that he kept as far away as he could from her at the end of the sky at night. Ever since, he tries to keep a long way behind the sun, and when he does sometimes come out near her in the west, he makes himself as thin as a ribbon so that he can hardly be seen. So we can see the common elements in these two myths. And so what I decided was, I had a lot of experience with parallel myths, myths that are shared in between tribes within my own nation. But it was the first time that I had seen that tell told outside of the Eastern nations of the Southeast. So I was curious and I started looking into moon origin myths and incest myths. And what I found was a trail that led all the way from Siberia all the way down to Tierra de la El Fuego. So starting up here, we have that same myth as the moon origin myth. And it runs all the way down into the Southeast. Once it gets to the Southeast, it starts varying from soot to paint, right? So finding that connection, I also started looking at the burgeoning DNA that was starting to come out, the haplogroups. And I followed those as well, all the way down with the myth, making connections about migration. And I'm a firm believer in the reverse south migration as well. There's more evidence of older artifacts being found in the very southern part of South America than there are up in around Beringia. So that was my first foray into a Pan-American myth. Okay. From there, I started looking at circummigration of indigenous peoples to and from the southeastern United States into the Caribbean. I said, well, there's obviously a connection here. So I started looking into the Indian slave trade because there was a huge Indian slave trade between the southeastern United States and the Caribbean. And what happens here is that the southeastern trade usually came out of the Carolinas. From the Carolinas, they would take slaves from different tribes. The Cherokee were slave owners, the Choctaw were slave owners, the Creek were slave owners. They would raid other settlements down into Florida and trade these enslaved peoples to trade slavers that would take them down to Antigua, Barbados, Guyana. And so I said, okay, let's see if there are any similarities that I can find that can connect my Southeastern nations with some of the Creole nations in the Caribbean and the Circum-Caribbean. The first character that I found similarity with was the Baku from Guyana. And Baku is a small person, right? Or as we can see in the picture, a little anthropomorphic, right? Elfin. And in Guyanan culture, the Baku was a trickster. He would throw stones, he would scare people, he would scare animals so that hunters couldn't find them. And it was the same with the Choctaw Bopoli. The Bopoli, again, is a small person, right? He was also a trickster figure. He was small in stature. He would throw stones and he would make a lot of noise. So that was something that both the Baku of Guyana and the Bopoli from Choctaw mythology had in common. So that was a thread I found. And I said, okay, so was there interconnection between not only the indigenous groups, but the African groups who had mixed with the Indian nations in the Caribbean? The next character I looked at was Kashi Hotapalo, who was a Choctaw deer man, and Papabois, who is a deer man figure also in Trinidad and Tobago and St. Lucia. So deer man in the Choctaw Nation is said to be found in swampy areas around the coast. And he is very agile. He's fast of foot, another character that warns animals when hunters are after them. Papa Bois is a figure that also is agile of foot. He's very quick. And he also warns animals when people are hunting them. So they're protectors of animals. They're anthropomorphic figures. And that was another common thread that I found in Trinidad and Tobago. The next one, of course, if there's a deer man, there has to be a deer woman, is the deer woman from the Southeastern United States. Deer woman is a myth that runs all through the indigenous North Americas. In Cherokee and Eastern woodland mythology, she comes in human form, but from the waist down, she's a deer. She has hoofed feet, and she's a protector of women. She goes after men who are promiscuous or who abuse women and takes her revenge. The other two forms that you find within the nations in and around the Southeast are the anthropomorphic, who is woman and animal, right? Again, she has the ears, the deer, she has the antlers, and she has the feet, but her face is human. And then we have the sort of fawn figure that is totally half, right? The bottom part is the deer, the top part is human, and she has the antlers. In Trinidad and Tobago, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have La Diablesse or Jadablesse. In this culture, Diablesse only has one hoofed foot. She's a beautiful woman, always known to wear a white dress, and one of her feet is always hoofed. It's either a cow hoof, goat hoof, some type of hoofed animal. And she attracts men, again, like Deer Woman, she attracts men who are promiscuous and who mistreat women and takes care of them. Sometimes she takes them to a place and they'll drown, or she'll have them walk off the end of a cliff. So from folklore, common folklore, I put those elements together and I've written on that extensively. I'm still finding connections between folklore, between the Southeastern tribes and the Caribbean. But then I also went into a small point of time where I was looking at the origin of cannibal. And it turns out maybe not the origin, but I thought it was interesting. So I took a look at Wendigo, who's sort of a boogeyman in American indigenous folklore, at Canaima, who is also anthropomorphic and a cannibalistic figure in South American folklore. And then of course, at cannibals themselves. Well, not cannibals, but what Christopher Columbus called cannibals. The Wendigo, of course, is a spirit that infects humans by biting them. Once the Wendigo bites and possesses a person, the former Wendigo dies and is reborn within the new spirit. So indigenous parents would tell their kids, right? Don't go into the woods, because if you do, the Wendigo will get you. Or if a hunter disappeared on a hunting trip, right? The Wendigo got him. So Wendigo is a boogeyman. That's what you told people to scare them and to keep them away from you. In South America, we have the Canaima, which comes in two forms. The first one as a witch doctor, right? Who can transform into or shapeshift into a jaguar, and he takes care of his village. He goes after people in revenge if they don't keep promises. It was a myth that would keep other tribes away from the main tribe. Which took me back to the Bahamas, because why I even looked at this was because Columbus told, or the Arawaks, Tainos in the Bahamas told Columbus that the people who were to the south of their islands, he told them, don't go there because they're a Caniba or Canima. And Columbus thought that he said cannibal. So that was how the Kalinago became cannibals, right? Through someone's misunderstanding. And I feel that maybe Canaima was the root to cannibal because, of course, it was the myth going back, trying to scare these outsiders from going and searching for other people, you know, within their area. So I went through that. That was the research that led me to my next topic. Oops. Okay. Sorry about that. To my next topic, which was searching for symbols or symbolic things that could trace migration. In 2011, I read an article by Richard Thornton, and it was about petroglyphs in Georgia, a petroglyph that was found, and he couldn't find any. Let me go in. I'm going to pull up my next slide. Okay. Where did I find that before? Okay. I have a small pachacucha about my research on the Georgia petroglyphs. I'm just going to try to pull it up now in my files. Okay, I need to go back into share mode. Can you take me out of share mode so that I can go back in, please? Because I can't. Okay, stop share. Thank you.
Yes, no problem.
Okay. Let me go into my files and pull the next one to share. Okay. Okay, can you guys see that? Let me. Can you see the pachacucha file?
No, I think it's the same issue as the last time. We can see the downloads folder.
And I'm a professor at Inter-American University. Let me try it again. Puerto Rico. Today,
Oh, we hear it though.
Sorry about that. On the Native Americans that are of the Southeastern United States. Okay, wait a minute. Thank you.
This particular segment of my research began when I first saw an article written by Richard Thornton entitled, "Experts Solve Mystery of Ancient Stone Monument in Atlanta."
I'd like you to see it, so,
It caught my attention as it was the icon carved on the stone.
okay.
What was that doing in Georgia? Interestingly enough, Georgia holds many examples of early petroglyphs, such as those located in Fulton and Forsyth counties.
Can you
Were
see
these
that?
stones carved by local tribes, or were they carved by outsiders passing through the region?
Yes, we could see it now. Is it possible for to try to? Oh,
Yeah.
we could let it run like this.
Okay, let me,
The sound is a little bit muffled though. If possible, could you actually try sharing again? But
yeah,
I think there's a button to click maybe share sound. I think that might make a difference because right now it's just playing through your speaker.
oh. Okay,
I think
Let's
it's okay. Well,
let's see.
maybe you go ahead.
Okay,
This particular segment of my research began when I first saw an article written by Richard Thornton entitled, "Experts Solve Mystery of Ancient Stone Monument in Atlanta." It wasn't so much the title that caught my attention as it was the icon carved on the stone. What was that doing in Georgia? Interestingly enough, Georgia holds many examples of early petroglyphs, such as those located in Fulton and Forsyth counties. Were these stones carved by local tribes, or were they carved by outsiders passing through the region? Are the symbols traceable to other cultures? Can we determine contact through the possible cultural legacies others may have left behind? These questions serve as an exploration into my topic. Were there other outside indigenous influences on these cultures? That being said, the state of Georgia has one of the richest petroglyph and artifact traditions in the region, making it the ideal meeting ground for indigenous encounters. Looking at the following tri-state map, we can observe two major riverine entries into the region of the Gulf Corridor into the rich water basin of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. The Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint rivers to the east, and the Alabama Coosa and Tallapoosa to the west. The Sweetwater petroglyph is carved into a schist stone that weighs about 250 pounds. It's 46 inches high, 22 inches wide, and 10 inches deep at its greatest dimension. The petroglyph was discovered in 1909 by William Roberts while he was out hunting wild turkeys along Sweetwater Creek in Douglas County, Georgia. Looking at the figure, I first thought it could be a guardian entity. You know, one that advises travelers if they're entering a specific province or sacred area belonging to a powerful people. In his research, Thornton identifies it as Mabuya, a Kalinago spirit who possesses its unsuspected victims and causes illness. After much thought, I now feel that the figure could be an interpretation of Boy Najel, the Taino god of rain, protector of crops. Why? In the 1930s, two archaeologists working ahead of a major building project found several varieties of tubers growing wild near the original site, a finding that had been previously attested to in local archaeological records. As described in their notes, the crops looked like bushy morning glories, but had large edible tubers growing underground. According to their description, these mounded areas, or canupos, likely contain batata or ñame. And although intensive land development over the years has eliminated the patches, there are still some sketches that exist. Linguistic evidence also exists to support the settlement of indigenous Caribbean peoples in this area. Some of the town names mentioned in Thornton's review definitely contain Ainu entomons. For example, Toa, meaning Great River, is one of the towns Hernando de Soto encountered during his first expedition into Georgia in the 1500s. From 1564 to 1565, René Gallen de Landonnière recorded several provincial and town names that ended in the Taino suffix "coa," meaning place. Decoa, Stecoa, Stedicoa. Etymology aside, there is very significant evidence that indigenous peoples from the Caribbean traveled our riverine systems and settled in and around the Atlanta area. Over the years, other petroglyphs have been located that do not exhibit signs of having been carved by local tribes, such as the Forsyth and Reinhardt petroglyphs. The circles and spirals that dominate these surfaces are also commonly found on petroglyphs throughout the Greater and Lesser Antilles. Here's something interesting. None of these boulders in northern Georgia are directly associated with indigenous town sites, but they are typically on top of natural features which are visible from a distance. What the boulders do share is an association with ancient trading paths, virtual landmarks for travelers in ancient times. At this point, I would like to transition away from what we've been discussing to some of the possible influences brought in from the Caribbean. There are various examples, but I'd mainly like to focus on head flattening or cranial modification, tattooing, and blowgun usage. Head flattening in the Southeast was practiced by numerous tribes, the Choctaw and Chitimacha, who flattened the heads of male babies, and the Caddo, who flattened the heads of hereditary political and religious leaders. Statuses were determined through their matrilineal descent system, much like the Taino of the Greater Antilles. In Caribbean indigenous cultures, head flattening was practiced among the Taino and Kalinago throughout the Greater and Lesser Antilles. Evidence of cranial modification can be found in the archival accounts of Christopher Columbus, Fernandez de Oviedo, Francisco de Tamara, and Jean-Baptiste Labat, just to name a few. Tattooing among the tribes of the Caribbean was first documented by Christopher Columbus when he arrived at San Salvador in the Bahamas on October 13th of 1492. Subsequent documentation from other Spanish chroniclers, such as Dr. Diego Alvarez Chanca and Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo, confirms these findings. Early historical documents have revealed widespread traditions of tattooing among the tribes of the Southeast. Hernando de Soto and the 4 chroniclers that he had with him on his expeditions were the first to document tattooing among the tribes of coastal Florida and Mississippi. It's important to note that tattooing was especially common among the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Natchez, Caddo, and Chitimacha. Blowguns were another possible cultural link between the Southeast and the Caribbean. Use of blowguns by North American tribes has only been documented in the Southeastern United States. These woodland tribes owned river cane, much like their Caribbean counterparts, and the blowguns for hunting small birds and animals. Evidence indicates that there was significant pre-Columbian cultural contact and exchange between the indigenous Caribbean and the Southeast. This gives the concept Circum-Caribbean new meaning, suggesting that our understanding of this term needs to be expanded from its colonial context to include the much longer and culturally more complex era of pre-colonial contact. Thank you.
Okay, I'm hoping that you got to hear that. Was it?
Yeah, sounded good.
Okay, thank you. I'm getting nervous about this because the sound is, I don't know. Anyway, so I did my research in Georgia and I found it really fascinating. I'm still pursuing that line of investigation. I'll be going to Alabama. I've been invited to go to a couple of caves up and around Birmingham that have what is believed to be Taino petroglyphs inside so that I can investigate there. Not only did the Taino go up to Atlanta, they migrated over to the west. They can also, there's a lot of evidence being found in Birmingham and upper northeast Alabama that they came and they settled there as well. Okay. Now I'd like to pull up, let me stop sharing for a moment, my main talk for today. Okay, let me share again. Okay. Can you guys see the screen?
Not yet. Yeah, I see your downloads folder again.
Okay, let me try it again. All right. I don't know why I'm having such snafu today. Okay. Let me stop sharing and try to upload it again. Okay. Can you see it now?
Oh, it's still on the downloads folder. I'm not sure what you did the last 2 times, but
I played with it. I played between screens.
Usually they give you an option, like when you click on share, you get an option. Can you hear me, Melinda?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think they give you an option, one of which is this sheet, this page. The other would be the thing you want to open. As far as whenever I use these, there's always an option and you pick one. They give you all the options, one of which is this, and the other would be the slide you want to share. I don't know if that happens here, but I think it does. But I'm not able to see anything. I'm not able to help in any other way.
Hi, Nalini. Let me try again.
When you click on share, there's another box that opens with the options.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I saw that. Let me go back. Okay. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah, got it. So you can see.
Okay, thank you so much, Nalini. It's been a rough morning. Okay. So this is my research into the migration of Native Americans from the Southeastern United States into the Northern Caribbean. Again, circummigration. Okay. So Amerindian migration has a long history. In addition to traditional migratory patterns, various indigenous groups and individuals migrated because of contact with European colonists. They were fleeing from them. Post-contact colonial governments in the Southeast created treaty lands in which many indigenous were encouraged to relocate, right? They were trying to get them out of areas, the colonists where they wanted to settle. Other migrations, notably as contact increased, resulted from Native Americans being attacked or attracted for various reasons, right? To colonial settlements, military and trading posts offered many opportunities for them. They had protection, right? From the people who were pursuing them, the slave traders. Missions had similar attractions and were usually more drastic in their results. They were put into sort of forced labor once they joined a mission. Although their importance in the European development of the Southeast is frequently overlooked, Native American knowledge and labor were vital to the newly arrived settlers. Native Americans were often recruited or forced into labor either by the missionaries, soldiers, or colonists. Withdrawal from European contact was possible only for those living in areas where settlers had little need for their labor or desire for their lands. Okay, a lot of them came down into the swamp areas. The upheaval and ultimate migration of Native Americans occurred in many areas as a result of war and economic subservience. As a result of these events, this talk will focus on the migration of Native Americans from the Southeastern United States into the Northern Caribbean. Some of the questions I explored, right, was why is it necessary for these tribes to leave their traditional lands? What prompted their departures? With whom did they depart? Where did they resettle? Or not? Are there still remnants of their people today? During the 16th century, Spanish invaders began arriving in what is now the southeastern United States from various outposts in the Hispanic Caribbean, mostly Cuba, right? Puerto Rico. The first documented expedition to arrive on the continent was that of Juan Ponce de Leon in 1513. Ponce de Leon's arrival in Florida was the beginning of Spain's exploitation and colonization of the Southeast, which was only ended when Spain ceded Florida back to the United States in 1821. So based on the appearance of at least one Spanish-speaking indigenous person during de Leon's first trip, this expedition was clearly preceded by the arrival in South Florida of at least some indigenous fugitives from Cuba. Of course, they were fleeing, right? The Spanish, because the Spanish were enslaving them, many of whom ultimately settled within a single town within the Calusa territory. Calusa territory is here in the south. And that was within some of the swamp systems, the Everglades. Okay. So descendants of the initial indigenous Cuban migration to Florida were reported to have still been living within the territory as late as the 1560s. Ironically, while Florida initially served as a haven for Caribbean Cuban refugees from the Spanish conquest of that island in 1511, in a reversal of fortune, it would ultimately be Cuba that served as a final haven for indigenous Floridian refugees 2 centuries later. Though Ponce de Leon, though Ponce de Leon did not return to Florida until 1521, there is clear evidence of Spanish slaving there long before that date. Cuban vessels dispatched by Governor Diego Velázquez were later accused of having brought back some 300 indigenous Floridians as enslaved people prior to 1517, confirming that Southeastern Native Americans began to be transported to Cuba within just 4 years of first contact. You can see some of the different tribes that were decimated actually during the Southeastern slave movement. The Gual disappeared, the Pensacola, the Ice, the Jagan. Okay. So Cuban vessels also maintained trade, right, with the Floridians after this fact. They traded with them from the 16th century into the early 19th centuries. And the people they traded with were mostly immigrant Seminoles. From 1704 to about 1760, several hundred refugees from slave raiding across Florida fled to Cuba on Cuban vessels. That was when Florida ceded to the British for a short period of time. Okay. When that happens, all of the Mission Indians from St. Augustine, which I think there were about 89 left, and the other 400 or 500 from other tribes left and went to Cuba. The final destination of the last pure Calusa was Guanabacoa, which is up here just outside of Havana, a village near Havana, where they were taken by Spaniards along with the survivors of the other original Floridian tribes when England took over Florida in 1763. Aside from the Calusa, it was the Tequesta and the Tamaqua who were initially settled in these villages. And once they started getting a little overcrowded, the Cubans started sending them down to Cienfuegos. And this is where you find a lot of evidence, heavy evidence of indigenous from the Southeast still surviving there in DNA. So like other Native American peoples, the pre-Hispanic tribes of Florida had a dramatic end. But according to historical evidence, their genetic traces could still be identified in Cuba. According to John Worth, who's done a lot of research in this area, especially in Cuba, this concentration could lead to more DNA evidence. When he was there in 2003, somewhere between 2003 and 2006, he found a lot of ecclesiastical records in the Church of Nuestra Señora in Guanabacoa that showed birth certificates of intermarriage between women from those tribes and Hispanic men or Cuban men. Okay. So from Cuba, at that point, we already had people who had escaped there and were already mixing with the population. We look at escaped enslaved Africans, right? Who fled to Spain from the English. From the beginning of the 18th century, Florida attracted numerous enslaved Africans who escaped British enslavement from the Carolinas and Georgia. And that was as early as 1688. Beginning in 1623, the official Spanish policy was that all enslaved people who touched Spanish soil and asked for refuge could become free Spanish citizens and would be assisted in establishing their own workshops if they were skilled as a trade, right, in a trade, or they would be given land if they were farmers. In exchange, they would be required to convert to Catholicism and serve for several years in the Spanish militia. This is how the Spanish kept their soldiers in Florida. These formerly enslaved people were settled at Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mos, which is better known as Fort Mose in St. Augustine, Florida, the first settlement of free Americans in North America. Formerly enslaved people also found refuge among the Lower Creek and or Seminole tribes who had established settlements in Florida at the invitation of the Spanish government. So after the American Revolution, enslaved people from the Carolinas, Georgia, and the Low Country escaped to Florida and were received by the Seminoles. So as they came in, they were going first into like the Okefenokee area and joining with the Seminoles who were living in the swamp there, and then migrating further south through the swamp system into the Everglades. Just as the Seminoles were made up of members of many tribes collectively known as the Lower Creek, the Black Seminoles came from many African regions and cultures. And they were a small offshoot of the Gullah Geechee, which I show here, the Gullah Geechee corridor that runs from North Carolina all the way along the coast down into Florida. They were small offshoots of the Gullah Geechee who escaped from the rice, cotton, and indigo plantations in these regions. The socio-political relations between the Black Seminole and Native American Seminole groups were multifaceted, shaped by economics, procreation, desire, and combat. Some Black Seminoles were fully bought into the tribe by marriage or adoption. Seminole marriage rules dictated that a child's ethnicity was based on that of the mother. If the mother was Seminole, her children were Seminole. We can see an example of that here where a mother has mixed race children with her. Other Black Seminole groups formed independent communities and became allies who contributed to the community in return for freedom and protection from re-enslavement. Still, others were re-enslaved by the Seminole, but it was said that the Seminole were far less harsh in their enslavement than the Europeans. Excuse me. Black Seminoles didn't have individual owners, but they did have to provide tribute and crops or cattle in return for the relative freedom that they had and protection from the slavers. They usually lived in separate but nearby towns or villages that you can see down here. Because they were in a swamp area, a lot of their outbuildings were built upon stilts. Some became successful farmers, cattle herders, and a few served as interpreters and military leaders during the Seminole War and rose to prominence in Seminole society. Billy Bowlegs and his Black Seminoles were well known during that war. No group would resist annexation more than the Black Seminoles. To lose the battle would mean that they would simultaneously lose their independence, their homes, and their freedom. So over a period of 7 years, the U.S. Army sent 40,000 troops to fight about 2,000 Seminoles. Approximately 500 of those were Black Seminoles. After 3 wars and a truce, no peace treaty was ever signed. And for this reason, the Seminoles are considered the unconquered people. In 1857, many Seminoles had been forcibly resettled via the Trail of Tears into Oklahoma, which ran, right? They took them by sea up into the port of New Orleans, up the riverine system, and into Oklahoma. The 100 or so Seminoles who stayed fled to the Everglades and now comprise the 3,000 plus Seminole tribe of Florida. So down here, we still have a population of Seminole as one of the few federally recognized tribes in the Southeast. Okay. For the Black Seminole, it all began in Florida, but their saga took them to Oklahoma, Texas, Mexico, and the Bahamas. Between 1821 and 1837, a faction of the Black Seminoles found their way to a colony at Red Bays in the north end of Andros Island in the Bahamas. Andros is right up here. The mass exodus happened in 1821, pursued and harassed by European Americans through the First Seminole War. Approximately 200 members of this group fled to Andros Islands, where they remained essentially isolated for 150 years. So in 1818, Britain had declared that any enslaved African that reached the Bahamas outside of the British West Indies would be manumitted, right? They would be freed from their owners. And it was just 20 years later, less than 20 years later, Britain abolished slavery. Okay. The Seminoles perceived the Bahamas as a natural refuge because of their alliances forged with the British in Florida. They had a long-standing trade relation with them, and that established them, right, to be in the Bahamas. A visit to the Bahamas by James Billy. Okay, the Black Seminole and Andros had sent representatives to Florida because they wanted to rejoin the nation. They wanted to be members of the Seminole Nation. When James Billy went, who was the former chairman, he found that there was too much intermarriage and it had thinned the bloodline too much, and that they didn't meet the blood quantum, which is a quarter for Seminoles. So they were denied. And I'm not sure, but I believe that they may have gone back to court to fight that because the Black Cherokee won their lawsuit against the Cherokee when they were disassociated a few years ago. They were brought back into the nation. So from all of this chaos came a new life. As previously stated, the Black Seminoles are a small offshoot of the Gullah Geechee who escaped from plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. They built their own settlements on the Florida frontier. They fought a series of wars to preserve their freedom, and they were scattered across North America and the Northern Caribbean. They've played a significant role in American history, but have never received the recognition that they deserve. As for the original Floridian tribes, who were resettled and began new lives in Cuba, They have become the quintessential mestizo quilt that makes up Cuban society today. I thank you all kindly for your attention, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this conversation back over to our forum host.
Yes, thank you so much, Melinda. I really
Thank you.
appreciate your talk. I especially appreciate your technological resilience as well.
It made me a little nervous.
And so now, without further ado, I invite Prof. Makoni to have a discussion with our guest.
Thank you very much, Melinda, for this fascinating talk. Let me get you back to the core of your argument, try and refresh my memory. What is the core of your argument? So the core of your research is that there was a movement by the Native Americans down south. Is that the argument that you are trying to pursue?
Yes, that there was movement. There was movement between these cultures, and it shows up in not only folklore, but physical evidence. Yeah, right. Through symbolism, through physical symbolism, through DNA, through multiple factors.
Okay. Now, if that is the case, let me be picky, and then you can help me see the bigger picture. What is the relationship conceptually between movement and migration?
Well, movement is migration.
So,
In my well, in my culture, everything is circular. We're not fixated on straight lines. We're circular in thought, we're circular in movement. I think one of the things I was looking at was the circularity and the sharing of cultures. Being a Caribbeanist and Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw, I found the interrelations fascinating.
So for you, then, everything is migration. Migration is not a special type of social behavior, because you said there's always constant.
It's movement.
Right.
It's movement and sharing. And
so life is movement. So everything is movement.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So migration, then philosophically for you, migration cannot be a special area of study, because everything is movement. And therefore
everything is movement, because people who came into the Southeast went back to the Caribbean.
Okay. Okay. So if that is the case, then how did migration studies begin and become separate, since everything is movement?
How can you separate it? I mean,
so your argument basically is this, is that there shouldn't be studies, special studies that focus on migration, because everything is movement.
Oh, I believe that there should be studies in migration. For indigenous people, especially here in the Americas, we moved. The Cherokee, in our folklore, it's believed that we came out of Peru, went up into the Algonquin sections of North America, and circled back down until we settled in the Carolinas. We stayed in the Carolinas until the Trail of Tears, but there were still people within the tribe. And this is research I did with Nick and Adam Krappel, right? The movement between tribes, the sharing of knowledge between tribes, especially during the Mound period of the Southeast. And that reaches far back even into the Mexico and Central America, because you had tribes coming up and sharing knowledge, intermarrying, and then sometimes returning back to the South.
Okay, then let me continue with the discussion so that I can clarify a couple of things for me.
Okay.
Yeah, yes. Can you explain to me the role of folklore in this intellectual enterprise that you have been engaged in?
Well, my grandmother is a storyteller, so I
Okay.
was raised in that tradition, and the easiest way for me to make connections in the beginning was finding similar characteristics within these folklores.
Okay.
So that's what drew me into the aspect of folklore as being able to trace the migration.
Okay. Okay. So what you were doing was to see if there were similar folklores.
Yeah, how they traveled. Did they
How they
travel?
can, okay.
Yeah.
Let's say, for example, the famous story of Ananse that is found in different parts of.
Yes.
Okay, right.
And we have many African-based folklore in the Cherokee culture.
Okay.
The Brer stories, right? The Uncle Remus stories.
Okay. Okay.
It's
Okay.
fascinating. I mean, you can
Yeah.
expand it.
Yeah, now I see it. Then what about the other artifacts? I can understand where folklore fits in, how they may mutate and change as they are appropriated by different ethnic groups.
Yes.
What about the issue of the different types of artifacts? You also, yeah.
What interested me in that actually was some of the Caribbean aspects in Cherokee folklore. How did it get there?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you have to go beyond folklore to see that. And finding things like the petroglyphs is concrete evidence, and crops from the Caribbean that aren't found in the Southeast. It's concrete evidence, right? That these people traveled. They traveled up through Florida. They went up the riverine systems and they settled, and they left all of these things behind to let us know that they were there.
Okay. 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 Yeah, that's fine. Now my last question is this. The narratives that you have, the analysis that you have presented so far, does it occur in other parts of the United States, or is largely within, let's say, South Carolina, Florida, and Cuba? This sort of movement that you were describing.
I'm sure that it could be expanded if somebody focused on it.
Okay.
I'm sure it could be. As I said, the research I did with Nick and Adam take us up into farther parts of North America, South Canada.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So let me stop here because there are a lot of other people who want to ask. This is fascinating stuff. Thanks a lot, Melinda.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for your patience. I apologize for all of my snafus today.
Yeah. Okay. Ian.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Makoni. We will open with one question from the chat. If you want to ask a question verbally, you can also raise your Zoom hand. But this first question comes from Nicholas Farklas. He says, "Thank you for this fascinating presentation. Folktales and stories, when looked at through a decolonial lens and when listened to with decolonial ears, can be subversive. That is, they can reawaken memories that can remind us all of what coloniality has attempted to and too often succeeded in making us forget. How do you see your work in relation to this erasure of memory, first among the indigenous peoples of the Mississippi, Gulf, Caribbean, Orinoco, Amazon corridor, and secondly among non-indigenous people?"
Well, there's definitely a connection, right? The result of stories, right? Stories are oral histories. There are histories, and it reminds us that there are things that we have to be aware of, right? It reminds us that, I don't know, stories are more than parables. And as oral histories, they remind us They want us to remember conflict. They want us to remember trauma. And looking at creolized literature in that sense, right, reminds us that we all are created from trauma. It reminds us that history is not just ethnocentric, right? It's not concentrated on just one culture, that we all share that trauma. And that's what I really liked about the Creole, right? Folklore, seeing that combined with the folklore, for example, from the Southeast. I don't know, Nick, if I touched on that enough, but your mic's off.
No, I think basically you answered this question. I wrote this question earlier in your talk, and I think you answered it as we went. So I think it connects in a really interesting way with Professor McConey's ideas or question about migration studies. Why should we have migration studies? Yes, why should we have migration studies? Just like, why should we have creolistics? Yes, why should we have creolistics? In other words, in many non-trivial ways, all languages are creoles. So why have a branch of linguistics called creolistics? Because all languages have these are the product of contact, and intense contact, multidimensional contact that impacts every aspect of any language or any named language. Okay, you can say the same thing about migration. So we've been on this planet for 300,000 years.
Yes.
Okay, for the first 290,000, and for some people, the first 299,000 and beyond, we were wandering. We were moving constantly, and we were doing what you were saying, what you were talking about, Melinda, all of this rich contact between peoples and among peoples. So, and people were moving for long distances, these networks. So again, why have a special branch of academia that talks about migration? Well, we still, okay, and why have a special branch of academia that we call it creolistics? Well, the problem is that coloniality has convinced us that the way it always was, the way it is, and the way it always will be, is that people were monolingual and people didn't connect with each other and people were not moving. So it's coloniality projected onto the way that human being, what is natural, what has become natural and normalized in our imaginations about how all of our ancestors lived.
Yeah.
So in other words, we do need a creolistics. We need a creolistics to reimagine what language is through the languages that don't allow us to live with those myths about what language is supposed to be. And just we need migration studies as well to challenge these ideas about human beings living in permanent settlements with one language and one culture and one ethnicity, one name language, one name culture, one ethnicity. So basically, these are dangerous ideas that have saturated the ways that we think. And so creolistics can be useful in dispelling us of those lies, colonial lies, and also migration studies can do that. So basically, I think this is one thing that your work can actually help in terms of how people have lost that memory of the fact that movement and contact were the rule rather than the exception for most of human history. And they still are, but now we try to pretend that they're not. okay? And basically most people's academic work begins with the premise that they are not, the erroneous presence, that these things are not the norm rather than the exception. And the same with creolistics and linguistics. Most linguists begin from the premise, the erroneous premise, that most languages are not contact languages.
Yeah.
They're not contact languages in any important sense. And therefore, creolistics has been, began its history juxtaposed by a juxtaposition of creoles as languages versus natural languages. So you can see the naturalization of that coloniality. So yeah, so I think this is dangerous work. Your work is dangerous because it really challenges people to remember some of this stuff. And and I think that is what to me is really, really important about your work. It begins with your grandmother, which I think is a great place to begin. Okay, and then it extends and extends and extends and extends so that we can begin to look beyond just what's now the southeast of the United States, beyond the Northern Caribbean, beyond the Mississippi, and find connections all the way through the Caribbean and then down into the Amazon and Orinoco. Very, very strong connections. So I think that those are the kinds of impacts that your work can have, both among the indigenous peoples of those regions, to help people to remember those connections and to extend what they might have heard from their grandmothers to an actual rich history that encompasses the entire region. And then for non-indigenous peoples, of course, all of our ancestors were also wandering, and for us to remember this and remember all of all of what that means in terms of not just the erasure of that particular memory of contact, but also the erasure of our memories of sovereignties, whether they be linguistic sovereignties, cultural sovereignties, technological sovereignties, those types of powerful relationships that we had, that all of our ancestors had with the world and with other people. Once people start to remember those things, then they become dangerous. Okay, and as long as people don't remember those things, as long as linguists continue to naturalize and normalize coloniality, as long as anthropologists continue to naturalize and normalize coloniality, as long as academics continue to naturalize and normalize coloniality, basically we're no threats. But as soon as those memories are in one way or another reawakened, we become a threat.
Yes. Thank you, Nick, so very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, Arthur, this is actually a nice follow-up question to that. Do you want me to read it on your behalf, or your mic's already off?
My mic is on. I can read it if you want me to.
Okay.
I can do it. It's no problem. I know you took the time to type it. It was a great talk. And
well, do you want me to read it or what?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, please go ahead. I mean, you could probably say it in your words better than I could.
Okay. Great talk, full of material I personally have never come across. I should have put an exclamation point behind that. Regarding the Black Seminoles who relocated to Andros Island in the Bahamas, do you have any information on, number one, their descendants who are still in the Bahamas, and number two, their language profile? In other words, what kind of English is or Gullah influence language do they speak? That's just an example of what might be in their current profile. And today, what's the language profile of Seminole descent peoples in Florida, if you have any information on that?
Okay, so, well, from what I understand, and Rosalind Howard wrote a wonderful book called Black Seminoles in the Bahamas. And that's published through the University Press of Florida in Gainesville. The Gullah, from what I understand, through their isolation, they've maintained quite a bit of their Gullah Geechee English Creole. I haven't gone and spoken to them personally yet, but from what I understand, they're still basically using that dialect or that Creole to communicate. What kind of English or Gullah influenced languages do they speak? Are you familiar with the Gullah, with the Gullah Creole?
Yes, in Georgia, South Carolina, around that part of the corridor.
Okay. And that was where a lot of the escaped enslaved came from. They slipped right down there into the Okefenokee. They must have had to have learned some Seminole to communicate with them. I would think that living in the Bahamas, even in isolation, they would have maintained their Gullah as well, and probably some more British English, right, from the colonizers there. Is something that I need to look into more because I haven't gone back and explored that since I finished that article. And you're very familiar, I'm sure, with the Creole because that was the mix of Western African languages, right? And English.
I'm a Creolist.
Oh, that's okay. Wonderful.
Well,
Maybe you can help me with that.
I just wanted to get some leads, and you gave me a very important one. And so that's my interest. I work primarily in African American English, but I have done work in Creole studies.
Okay, that's wonderful. I thank you so much for your question, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. Appreciate it. Vishna has a question about one of the folktales that you shared earlier. She said, "Thank you for sharing your knowledges with us." She wonders if you could comment more about the folktale wherein Cherokee women who seduced men were sheltered by a mother figure and then asked to jump off a cliff. She was wondering if you could say more about this story and then about its origins.
So I think you've probably mixed the two. Dear woman, right? Seduced men to protect women, right? She was a forest spirit, a protector of women. You're mixing that with the Diablesse, because Diablesse was the one, right, in South America, who was the temptress, and she did the same thing. She protected women of her village or her area by seducing these men who were predators of women into the forest, where she would either drown them in the river or take them to the closest cliff and throw them off. So that's the differentiation between the two. In Cherokee, she's beloved, and that myth has traveled up to Oklahoma. And I don't know if you ever watched the Hulu series Reservation Dogs. In that series, they introduce Deer Woman as one of the characters that protects one of the main characters from being preyed upon by a creep on the reservation. So that's the differentiation between the two. They're both protectors of women. The one that throws them off the cliffs is La Diablesse from Trinidad and Tobago. Or Guyana. That's the Guyanese one. Okay.
But can you also, I think, following up with Vishna's question, it sounds like you were saying that these two stories are perhaps related. Is this sort of like part of your argument, right? That the folklore is
Yes,
linked through
that
some
there
kind of
was,
like mobility and there's sort of almost like a not genealogical, but a yeah, you can see the parallels, and this is sort of evidence of people
well,
moving.
yeah, Guyana was an English colony, and that was where a lot of the Cherokee slaves were taken, the enslaved people from the Cherokee Nation. So I feel that maybe, you know, there was some interaction perhaps with not only the indigenous there, but the Africans that were bought as well later, that the story survived and sort of, you know, survived through that interrelationship or that interaction. Well, that's my
Yeah.
question. That's what I'm researching into.
Absolutely. Cecile has a comment that is sort of speaking back to what Nick and what Prof. Makoni were talking about the what Lisa Malky calls sedentarist metaphysics, which sees mobility through the lens of place, rootedness, spatial order, and belonging. Mobility is seen as a threat and a disorder in the system, and therefore a thing to control. This idea is very much linked to the previous talk we had last week. We were talking about the Romani populations. This sedentarist metaphysics is now embodied by political technologies of surveillance. It connects to Foucault's notion of biopower. And as Nick mentioned, it aligns with the colonial project of dividing up the world into territorial units and populations into nation-state-based territories.
Okay, which is an interesting statement. I wish I could have seen the talk last week. I'm not sure if Nick's here, but Nick is Romani. He has Romani heritage, so I know that's something that he knows quite a bit about. I don't see mobility through a Western gaze. That's my problem, I guess. I see it as a very indigenous way of being. I see it as a right, and I'm sure the Romani did too. I don't know. I don't know what else to say about that.
Well, Sally Coco, you have your hand raised. We have something to add to that or a different question?
Both of them. One is that what I take from this presentation is that it is very important to learn about the worldview of indigenous people in the Americas, and that they had narratives that really highlight patterns of migrations from the north to the south. But this is quite interesting in the first of all, because Makoni and Nick alluded to it, that knowledge, academic knowledge inherited from and developed during colonization has led us to believe that really knowledge of the world starts with Europe. And all of us have inherited that. And why we need studies of migration, colonialism, and whatnot is that too much had been erased that should be brought back into the picture so that we can think about it. And one thing that underscores the importance of migration is that if you look at the history of mankind, we have always been migrants.
Yep.
And it sometimes calls into question the idea of indigeneity. In my 2001 book, I said we should be speaking of degrees of indigeneity. For instance, if you go to North Africa, the Berber, to use the colonial name, the Amazigan, they preceded the Arabs. But when the Europeans arrived, then the Arabs became indigenous because they had migrated there before Europeans. But there was second generation indigenous people because the Amazigh had preceded them. And we don't know which other populations had preceded the Amazigh. You have to really go and do a lot of paleontology to figure out what the history of the region is. And everything in the world, you're going to find migrations. In my work, I speak of population movements. Take China, for instance. Non-Semitic populations had preceded the Semitic population. The Semitic populations were colonized by other non-Semitic populations. And then after that, the Semitic populations prevail. And we have an empire-sized republic that we call China. So this is interesting. But if you go back to people like Luigi Cavalli Sforza, that did it, the analysis from the point of view of genetics. And what he says is the whole world is a diaspora. We migrated out of Africa. And throughout these migrations, we didn't all migrate at the same time. And some of us colonized others. And there is a history, as I put it also in my work, it's a history of layers of mutual colonization and stuff. So that the thing to underscore, I think, is that it's sedentary-based creation of knowledge shouldn't be trusted. The idea of pure cultures and so forth is a myth.
Yes.
Because when you look at the migration history of people around the world, there couldn't be any single modern culture that is pure, that hasn't borrowed from anything else, and from some other population and so forth. And so this is really important. So it's a matter of redressing the construction of knowledge so that we can bring back all these important dimensions of our histories that had been either obliterated or erased or ignored completely. And so that is very important. Okay. So I'll pitch in something. There is a book of mine that is coming out at the end of June. And I tell this kind of narrative. It's called Ecological Perspectives on Language Endangerment and Loss. But to do this, I had to just bring in migration, population context, language shift, and show how in the history of mankind, this has been a recursive process. So thank you very much. This is really enlightening, through your presentation of worldview of Native Americans as they see the world.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your commentary, and I agree with you on many things. It's very important to continue pursuing. Thank you. And could you write the name of your upcoming book in the comments, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I kind of had a really small follow-up. If anybody else thinks of a question in the meantime. One of the things that I learned a lot when I took a course with Makoni, of course, is this project of disinvention, of looking at the world from a global South perspective and being able to recognize the labels and the names that are put on, groups of people or places are oftentimes imposed from without rather than, I guess, generated from within. And I guess I wonder, how does it, talking about this this circulation and as Nick had put it, multi-dimensional contact, in what ways might your work disrupt the ways that we might put names on groups of people?
Well, that's the other thing I have battle with is naming, right? Because once you name something, it belongs to you, according to the Western philosophy. Well, I have very conflicted thoughts about that. Nick knows me well. He knows what I've been through and how I explore things. I really don't know how to answer that for you. I can tell you that it's difficult for me to follow a Western tradition in my work. Regardless of what it's called, I find it difficult. And sometimes I have to, but let me think about that for a minute. Okay.
Oh yeah, of course. I didn't expect it to be an easy question. It was just something that I couldn't
Oh.
stop thinking about as I was listening to your talk and how you were sort of challenging these notions of fixity and of static place, thinking
Yeah,
about the movements.
nothing's an indigenous with any indigenous person around the world. I think is static. I always see it as pure movement.
Thank you. Nick, you have your hand raised again?
Nick,
Yeah,
microphone.
yeah. No, just to pick up on the comments that were made by Sally Coco about indigeneity. Yes, but I think that that indigeneity we can also look at in the same way that we look at creolistics or migration studies, is especially if we look at the way those who claim indigeneity are talking about indigeneity today.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who are claiming indigeneity recognize the fact that there has been movement. There's no such thing as a pure culture, a pure language, a pure ethnicity, a pure bloodline. So I think that that's not what people are focusing on. The groups of indigenous people that I've worked with focus sovereignty. It's a relationship to the world, or not even to the world, with the world. So, and that is how they define indigeneity. So just like in creolistics, creoles are the languages that can best remind us of what has always been the norm with language rather than the exception. It's sort of a radical anti-exceptionalist stance. So, okay. And I think that you can do the same with indigeneity, okay? So that, yes, in a sense, everybody is indigenous, and in a sense, nobody is in. But the people who identify as indigenous today can say, yes, we are all indigenous, but that indigeneity meant a certain relationship to the world, a certain relationship to land, a certain relationship to culture, a certain relation to language. And this is what they want to remind us all of. That sovereignty. And so, yes, in a very non-trivial sense, everybody in the world is indigenous, but to reclaim that indigeneity means to remember sovereignty.
Yep.
That, yeah, and so I think that is so it's just like we can say, well, all languages are Creole languages, so let's not do Creolistics anymore. Or all people are migrants, so let's not do migration studies anymore. Or all people are indigenous, so let's not do indigenous studies anymore. No, we have to take a radical anti-exceptionalist stance and say what those who consider themselves today to be indigenous have to teach us is about sovereignty. And I think that that's what comes out of these stories as well. And I always remember, Melinda, your grandmother your mother taking you to the mountains.
Yeah,
so
it was.
Yeah, and that was about my next question is about, okay, so when she took you, it always strikes me, when she took you, you know, you would expect her to to take you to the mound and climb it, but that's not what she did she?
No,
What did she do?
she told us to feel the mound, to feel it. And it was true. There was a power that emanated from this structure. And a lot of it came from the feeling of connection, of deep connection, that happened at every mound she took us to. But that mound in particular in Elmore County in Alabama was special. It was special to her because it was affiliated with our own people. So yeah, it was this feeling of complete connectedness that I would feel when I was there.
So when we talk about sovereignty with land,
Yes.
you know,
And with
that resonates
culture.
with me. Yeah, and culture. Yeah, and the idea that if you, okay, so rootedness is a funny idea, because yes, people often interpret rootedness as something that's associated with people who live in one fixed place, and that whole sedentary way of looking at the world. But people who travel, people who move, often see that rootedness as everywhere. Okay, so in other words, rootedness can be also upended and subverted and transformed in such a way that if you have sovereignty with the, wherever you are, you belong. Okay, so and you can reassert that connection no matter where you are. Okay, and so this is another interesting aspect of sovereignty. And so that relationship that you felt with that mound was very interesting. But the mounds themselves, they're found throughout the Southeast and beyond. Yeah. We have them in Brazil, we have them all over the place, even into Bolivia. These mounds, in terms of what they represent, in terms of the circummigration that you're talking about, in terms of like times when people would get together. So in other words, if people are wandering, there will be times when they would come together periodically. Yes. These behaviors have been found not just in humans, they've been found in elephants and whales and dolphins, etc. Certain time during the year, different groups that are wandering come together. And so at the end of June, there's going to be a conference in Prague of the big European African Studies Centers Conference. And it's called Afropolitanism. Afropolitanism, as if Africans are discovering cosmopolitanism. You see? So in other words, what your work is doing, it's erasing that, it's undoing the erasure of the cosmopolitanness of indigenous peoples in the Americas, of the fact that those mounds were gathering places where people exchange not just goods, they exchange linguistic repertoires, they exchange storytelling repertoires, they exchange cultural repertoires, they exchange technological repertoires, they exchange ethnic repertoires, they exchange partners. That's where they got married.
That's right. It's like a university system.
Not from their own. Biological, genetic repertoires got exchanged. Okay. And think about it. Okay, so what is a university supposed to be, and what is the sham of the university that we have today? Those were universities. That was cosmopolitanism. That was globalism, but it was globalism from below. It was cosmopolitanism from below. It was university from below.
Yeah.
Not from above, not colonially imposed, but people creating it and doing amazing things with it. and retaining their sovereignty. So when you learn somebody else's repertoire, you did it in a sovereign way. You didn't
Yes.
let that control you, you controlled it. So if you learn a technology, you control that technology, or you don't have anything to do with it. Different is that from us today?
It's true. And we've discussed
Do
this
we
many
have
times.
sovereignty over this thing, or does this thing have sovereignty over us?
But,
Yep.
but Nick, do you imply that there were no power dynamics? Sorry, I lost my voice.
Oh.
Nick, do you imply that there were no power dynamics within these exchanges? Which I doubt.
Okay.
You
First of
know,
all, yeah, go ahead.
no, I like what I'm hearing, but I'm just, you know, because you seem to imply that everything was smooth, everything was, you know, and which
yeah.
it doesn't erase, you know, this cosmopolitanism. And in the cosmopolitan literature, we've been talking a lot about this from below. I mean, that's not something that just came up. Okay. But my question is, I totally agree that there were exchanges, etc., but we shouldn't also erase the kind of tensions which are part of any contact of population, you know. So I just wanted to make this kind of little footnote.
And in relation
Melinda,
to
did
this,
you have a reply?
sorry,
It sounded like you wanted to say something to what Cecile was commenting.
I wanted to say something.
Oh, Melinda.
Yeah, this was in relation to, I mean, I guess it does relate to what Cecile said, but I have my question on the side. And I said, in relation to all we've been discussing on the colonial settlement migration movement issue, what is the role of gender? And there was a little typo there. If indigeneity is distinguished by movement, as Melinda said, to what extent do women lead these movements? Colonial settlements and even officially recognized migrations are male-led usually. And I think one of the differences between migration and movement, which Melinda said, and it came up in the other Dr. Makoni's question, is that migrations tend to make it into history. You always speak about, you know, I mean, we do acknowledge migrations, even if they happen to be, you know, minority migrations, we acknowledge them in history. We tend not to keep track of what you're calling movements, which would be smaller, perhaps smaller movements. And in this, all of this, I think gender is really important. Are there any women-led movements as such, or do people keep track of how these movements happen? And I'm speaking of, you know, in other cultural contexts, you can have movements actually led by women, which might begin a religious group. You know, it's not an official migration, but it is a movement. So this just is not a question, Melinda. I'm not putting you on the spot, but just saying that I'm sort of reacting to all of our discussions on migration movement and just bringing gender, which I think would refer also to what Cecile is saying, which is structure in all of this.
Well, go ahead. I had meant to add something to rejoinder to Nick's comments. It's not that everybody is indigenous. I think you have to clarify it. Everybody is or was indigenous somewhere. And that because there's some notion of precedence, which population arrives where first and before another population. That's how we see it. And sovereignty and so forth, they follow from the same principle. But I would also like to add that there are certain things, there are forms indigeneity that do not arise at the same time. For instance, Nigerian Pidgin English. Is it an indigenous language to Nigeria or not? For me, it is. It didn't exist anywhere else. English was brought to Nigeria, but out of the contact between English and Nigerian languages, we get this language called Nigerian Pidgin English. I'll make it more difficult for you. The Afrikaners, are they indigenous to Africa or not? You know why they took the term Afrikaner? To distinguish themselves from Europeans that came later. So relative to the British, they claimed to be indigenous. And that they took that particular term. So that's why I came up with this idea of degrees of indigeneity, because let me another one and then I stop. I'm not indigenous to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't my child born in the United States indigenous to the United States, although not as indigenous as Native Americans? You know,
Well,
when you're relativizing, you see the kind of can of worms that we are opening here. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if your son's born in the States, then he's a citizen, right? But that doesn't make him indigenous. That's how I see it. Okay.
Indigenous relative to me, or relatively indigenous relative to me, relatively indigenous to all migrants in the past 20 years or so.
Well, they would be citizens. They would be citizens. I see people who are not indigenous as citizens.
Yeah, not as indigenous as Native Americans. Those are the people that really claim.
They were the first migrants.
The longest lasting, yes, in indigeneity. If Native Americans had found other populations before them, then, you know, the claim of indigeneity would be relatively reduced compared to those other populations.
But they were the first human beings to people the Americas, so they become the indigenous, right? And they came supposedly from the north, but there are populations that obviously came from Australia, Melanesia across as well. And then there were populations that came down from Asia, right, through Hawaii and down through, right, all of these little islands into South and Central America. So we have a lot of different people coming in if you look at DNA and haplogroups.
Yeah.
So it's
sorry. Yeah, sorry for intervening, but I think you are passing each other. You are not talking about the same thing. Okay.
Probably.
I mean, I'm talking about my dear Sally. I think the problem you are passing each other because you are not taking the same unit of analysis. Sally, you are taking the unit of analysis of the nation state. What Nick is talking is not taking, or what Melinda is talking. They are not taking the nation state as a unit of analysis. Therefore, you know, you are talking about two different things. That's why Nick invokes the notion of sovereignty, because sovereignty implies that the nation state.
My dear Cecile, before the notion of nation state, there was a notion of nation.
Sure, which didn't align.
So, and the term nation applied to ethno-linguistic identity.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
But also, you know, maybe I think yes. I think that is one element of why maybe Melinda and Salikoko are passing each other.
Yeah.
But I think that actually, Cecile, you're right. You're right, Cecile, to when you identify sovereignty as a lens through which we can look at claiming indigeneity, or reawakening indigeneity. because, okay, going back to Nigeria, okay, to juxtapose, which is Nigerian English Exifier Creole with Nigerian English. Okay, this is a very interesting point that you brought up, Salikoko, because I think that we can look at Niger as a language that that most Nigerians would consider to be an indigenous language. Okay, not because of the words or anything like that, but because of how Niger, because it's not standardized, allows people to assume sovereignty with their linguistic repertoires. Okay, so when you speak Niger, you have much more permission to do creative things. You can integrate into your repertoires all kinds of things that come from other name varieties. You can also express yourself in such a way that you assume sovereignty in a communicative situation very easily. This is not so easy to do in Nigerian English. Okay, so in other words, it's interesting that you brought up that case because, again, English, which is a killer language in so many contexts, is in Nigeria. You would think that Niger, being it is probably the fastest growing language in the world. It will have the majority of the people in Nigeria already speak it, and probably within the next generation, 90% of the population will speak it. But up until now, it has not killed indigenous languages, other indigenous languages, because of the ways that these ancestral lifeways and these ancestral sovereignties with language have survived in Niger. I think, again, Cecilia, you were right. It's about sovereignty. And in terms of power relationships and power dynamics, yes, there are always power dynamics. Yes, there are always power relationships. But the consolidation of patriarchy, the consolidation of ethnocentrism, the consolidation of plunder, and all of its manifestations like the accumulation of wealth and capitalism and all that kind of stuff, and the consolidation of anthropocentrism, I think, are not there. We have no evidence of that before 10,000 years ago. Okay, and this is what we're talking about when we contrast the first 290,000 years with the last 10,000 years. So if you look at real practices, if you look at material art, if you look at all of that, there's little or no indication of patriarchy as a consolidated system. Ethnocentrism as a consolidated system, because people were constantly moving. In fact, and then anthropocentrism as a consolidated system, because if anybody had adopted anthropocentrism, they would be extinct. Okay, so any of those peoples who might have done that, they'd be gone anyway. And plunder, very little or no evidence of plunder for those first 290,000 years. So in other words, there are always power dynamics, there are always power relationships, but not the consolidation. And then but the problem is that we've normalized those systems of domination as the way it always was, the way it is, and the way it always will be. And we as academics have played, unfortunately, a major role in naturalizing that.
Yeah.
This is a very rich discussion, and I hope that we can continue it on into the after party. I just wanted to address one final question from Nana Ana, which was kind of related to what everyone was talking about in terms of place, mobility, nation state. Considering the multifaceted nature of home, including ancestral lands, cultural identity, social networks, and spiritual connection, how did the migration from the southeastern U.S. to the northern Caribbean disrupt or transform these different dimensions of home for affected peoples?
Well, I think it would depend. I would think that going into Cuba, right, and having to fit yourself into a whole different culture made them perhaps lose their feeling of home, right? They were displaced. I feel that the people who were moved to, or who went to Andros, right? Both peoples moved freely, but the people who went to Andros maintained more of their culture. They remained isolated. They had their language. They had land they could claim. They weren't placed there by somebody else. I feel that in terms of the Black Seminole, I feel there was no feeling of displacement. But with the natives that went into Cuba, I don't know. I feel that they had to really merge into the society. I lost their culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Melinda. Before we wrap up and go into our after party to continue the discussion, Makoni, do you have any final words?
I do. I like the debate that Sally and Cecile were having. It was interesting at a number of different levels. And unlike Sally, I wouldn't have the courage to disagree with my spouse academically in public. Otherwise, the whole situation domestically would erupt when the whole thing is over. My brother Sally, I respect your control of events, right? so we can move on to the after party where everything is open for discussion, and there may be a number of people who want to jump in and say a couple of things, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just as a brief,
Yeah.
just as a brief announcement before everybody jumps in, I just wanted to let people know about our next scheduled speaker, who is Priya Parota Natarajan, who will be speaking with us next week about sound. And so I think she's actually here today, which is wonderful.
Oh,
So
okay.
Hi, Priya.
Yes,
Hi,
hi.
Priya. How are you?
Yes, I am here indeed. How are you all?
What are you going to be
Great. Thank you
talking
for
about?
coming.
What are you going to be talking about? Don't tell us, but yes, we can.
Well, so basically,